Hey, good afternoon. My name is Buzz McLean, a rugby football referee and spokesman for the Shar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and I'd like to welcome you to the Fall for the Book 2020. These free online events run from September through November. This is the penultimate event. We've got one more this week. If you want to tune it in, you can see it in the calendar on fallforthebook.org, and that's where the whole schedule's been. And you can do that by clicking on the icon above this window and just click follow. And we're coming to you live today from the Paw Paw Public Library in Paw Paw, West Virginia, a village. It's so nice you have to say it twice, Paw Paw. And we'd like to thank everybody here for loaning us their internet today. We really appreciate it. The title of this session is More Than a Game, The Meaning of Sports in Turbulent Times. The three books we're featuring deal with sports, true, but more than that, they put sports at hand in the context of the culture and society at the time the drama was taking place. And oh yes, there was drama. This seems to always be drama. Let's meet the authors. And we're gonna go in alphabetical order. We have Sasha Ambrasky, the author of Little Wonder, the fabulous story of Little Dodd, the world's first female sports superstar, a title that only hints at Lottie's athletic career. Then we have Seth Berkman, who's new A Team of Their Own, how an international sisterhood made Olympic history, takes a look at the reluctantly unified Korean women's Olympic ice hockey team in 2018. You didn't know they had one, did you? And way down the alphabet, let's meet Thomas Wolfe, who does a deep dive into an iconic baseball moment with the cold shot. Babe Ruth, the Chicago Cubs, and the unforgettable Major League Baseball season of 1932. Gentlemen, this being a sports presentation, we're going to turn this program into a game. Each time you tell us something we did not know, you get a point. And the author with the most points at the end wins. How do you like that? Everybody game?
Ready to go.
Okay.
Read on.
This is a conversation among the four of us. If you have a question for somebody else, feel free to turn and chat to anybody, okay? Let's start with the book that takes us back the farthest, to Victorian times. Sasha, what was the world like when Lottie Dodd was trying to make a name for herself in sports, specifically in tennis?
So, first of all, thank you for hosting this event. I am so delighted to be doing this today with all the authors. So if you go back to 1871, nearly 150 years ago, Lottie Dodd was born in the high Victorian period into a family that had made an absolute fortune buying and selling cotton. They'd been importing cotton from the American South and selling it all over Northern England to the manufacturers around Manchester. And she grew up fabulously wealthy in this estate outside of Liverpool. So what did the world look like in 1871? Well, the first and most obvious point is, even though the most famous person on earth at that time was a woman, Queen Victoria, by and large, women had no power. They had no political power. They had no right to vote. When they married, their finances were transferred over to their husbands. They basically existed as a subservient half of the population. Lottie Dodd grew up in that world. She grew up in a world where when women played sport, they had to wear corsets, they had to wear dresses down to their ankles, they had to wear arm-length clothing that went all the way to the edge of their hands, because otherwise it was seen to be unacceptable to be out in public. And Lottie Dodd comes on the scene at the absurd age of 11 years old. And she starts touring Northern England and winning tennis tournaments. And by the time she's 15, you asked for facts that people didn't know. First fact, by the time Lottie Dodd was 15, she was Wimbledon champion. She was the youngest, either male or female tennis player to ever win a Grand Slam tennis tournament. And that record holds. She won her first tennis tournament at Wimbledon in 1887. Fast forward to 2020, no 15-year-old has ever won a Grand Slam tennis tournament since. So that's the world she grew up in. I could tell you a whole bunch more about what makes it different from today, but that will come out in the conversation over the next 45 minutes.
Right, and you scored 2 points there for telling us a couple of things we did not know.
We're getting up to work in the morning in California.
Tom Wolfe, are there political parallels between now and when Babe Ruth was vexing the Chicago Cubs in the World Series in 1932?
Yeah, there are. I mean, I didn't realize that there would be quite as many as there actually are when I was actually working on the book. 1932 was a presidential election year. The country was in dire economic straits, 25% unemployment. We were in the midst of near the end of prohibition, which everyone agreed was a failed experiment. And probably most significantly in terms of a comparison to today, there was a great deal of political discord. And in Washington, D.C. in 1932, there were more than 20,000 World War I veterans camped out between the White House and the Capitol, demanding an early payment of the bonuses they had earned in World War I. So in 1932, like in 2020, we had a presidential election, we had demonstrations in the streets, we had a very stressful time for Americans, and we had an economic crisis. We had basically everything except a pandemic in 1932, although I do touch on Babe Ruth in 1918, when the Spanish flu was a pandemic somewhat comparable and analogous to what we're dealing with today.
It's some things just never change, do they?
Right. Well, that's the nature of history.
By the way, everyone, if you have questions for us, please put them in the chat box, and we will get to them. Seth, it doesn't seem like things changed much over the years for women in sports. The women of the 2018 South Korean ice hockey team confronted prejudice and political gamesmanship. And does anything ever get easier for these athletes?
Yeah, I just want to say before we start, Buzz, I think you should get a point because I didn't realize that you were actually in the library until I saw people walking behind you. I thought it was a wallpaper.
The Ball Public Library, yeah.
Learned something there. But no, yeah, when it comes to the Korean hockey team, it really showed the lengths that not much had changed throughout the history of the Korean Peninsula when it came to women athletes in particular. The Korean hockey team was on the lowest rung of the totem pole, essentially. There were boys' youth teams, middle school teams who were afforded more resources and basically had better conditions for training than the women's hockey team did, until the point when they were suddenly thrust on the world stage and became part of this really geopolitical sports moment when all of a sudden everyone started to care about them, and then it changed dramatically.
Right, and the way that you put the book together, you introduce all the characters, and for the first couple of years and first couple of seasons, it's specifically the South Korean team. And then the International Olympic Committee says, well, you have to unify this. You have to have North Koreans on your team. And that really upset the chemistry, didn't it?
Yeah, the decision to add North Korean players occurred less than a month before the Olympics started. Kim Jong-un had kind of just floated the idea out there on January 1st of 2018 when he gave a big New Year's speech, as he traditionally does. And then it just became a scramble between the Korean governments, the IOC, and other bodies of, okay, how can we make this work? And so the North Korean players arrived about 3 weeks before the opening ceremony. So all of a sudden, the South Korean contingent, who was very upset at the time of the decision, then they also kind of figure out, how do we make this work in any kind of way? So.
Yeah. Hey, Sasha, so Lottie Dodd won Wimbledon, and she won, I think, 5 times. Is that accurate? How many sports did she actually participate in and excel in?
So this is what absolutely fascinated me when I started digging into Lottie Dodd's story. And very, very quickly, I'll say the way I encountered the story, I'm going to show you the actual book cover. That will probably be
okay, there you go.
The way I encountered the story, I was on a tour of Wimbledon a couple of Augusts ago in 2018 with my son, who's also obsessed with tennis. And we went down to the basement museum afterwards, and there was this sort of little corner about the Victorian champions. And I sort of thought I knew everything about tennis, but I'd never heard of Lottie Dodd. So I got intrigued, and I booked myself a research visit to the Wimbledon library for a few days. And in the library, they had these sort of bound volumes of sports journals from the late 19th century. And as I started doing the research, I suddenly realized I'd stumbled on this story, not just about this sort of early tennis champion, but this woman who broke every glass ceiling she possibly could in about a dozen different sports. So she quit tennis when she was 21. She got bored. She'd won Wimbledon 5 times by the time she was in her early 20s. There was no woman on earth who could beat her and very few men. She did a series of battles of the sexes, which is another thing I'm going to claim a point on for your audience not knowing. In 1888, she challenged 3 of the 4 top men in the world, including the 7-time Wimbledon champion, William Renshaw. And she beat them. She beat 2 of the 3 of them in that summer.
Wearing long sleeves and a long skirt and hobnails in her shoes.
That's right. And carrying a tennis racket that weighed over a pound. I mean, this was not a sort of graphite racket. This was a heavy wooden slugging machine. But she was just too good at tennis. Nobody could beat her. And she got bored. So she quit tennis. She became the British golf champion. She moved to Switzerland in the winters, became one of the top mountaineers on earth, became the top ice skater in Europe for women, conquered the Cresta toboggan run, which no woman on earth had ever done before. In fact, all women who had tried had been told, you can't do it, it will kill you. And then afterwards had a coda to her career in 1908 when she was in her mid-30s and already suffering terrible sciatica. She appeared in the London Olympics as an archer and got the silver medal in archery. So this woman went through every sport she could. Oh, I've forgotten one more. She played for the English hockey team as well. She went through everything she could at a time when women were being told, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. And Seth, you talked about the Olympics. If you go back to 1908, the head of the Olympic Committee was a Frenchman called Pierre Coubertin, who was on record as saying that the only role women should play in athletics was as cheerers and adulators for male athletes, and that part of the prize of conquest for a male athlete was female tribute. So that was the world that Lottie Dodd was competing in the Olympics. It was completely extraordinary.
Oh my gosh, yeah. And she also toured America as a golfer, right?
She did, and it was actually one of the few times in her career she bellied up. She was not used to losing, but she came to America and I think she got tired. She sort of overscheduled herself. It was just after she'd won the British Golf Championships in 1904. And she came out here and she toured the entire East Coast up and down. She went to New York, she went to Connecticut, she went up to Toronto in Canada and so on. And she overworked herself and she started losing to unknown women golfers from America who she was not supposed to lose to. And the American press ate her alive because there's nothing like a sort of, British imperialist brought down a notch or two in 1904. And so when you actually look at these sort of articles, and they were all over America, in Butte, Montana, and San Francisco, these small town newspapers were writing that Lottie Dodd, the English wonderkin, the little wonder, had kind of gotten her comeuppance, and she didn't enjoy it. She actually left America early, went back to England, and as far as I know, never came back to the States.
It was hardly fair because she was playing links courses in Europe, and then came over here and were confronted with the American style course. But
it was the American style course, and also the American style weather. She'd never encountered humidity like the East Coast in early autumn, and apparently it just destroyed her because she was used to playing in cold, rainy, drizzly England, and she comes out to New York and it's 95 degrees and more humidity than you can possibly imagine, and she just didn't know what to do with it.
Wow. Hey, Seth, the way you put your book together was really wonderful because you get to know the characters before the real competitive drama begins. It almost seems like you were embedded with the team at some point. Would that be accurate, or did you do all your research afterward, or were you on the site?
It was a mix. So the team based in South Korea, but about 3 times per year, they would come to the United States to hold training camps, mostly in Minnesota. And so often I would go out to Minnesota for a week or 2 and spend time around them. In their last training camp before the Olympics, so that was December, January 2017, 2018, they spread out a bit. So they were on the East Coast in Connecticut, New York for a bit before going to Minnesota. So whenever they came here, I spent time with the team for about a week or so. And then the only time I was actually with them in South Korea was at the Olympic Games. But that was like, I was in there, but I wasn't really with the team at all, just because at that point you did have the North Koreans involved. And so the security around the team was just heightened to the nth degree. I remember in trying to just catch up with the South Korean players at the Olympic Village, like I would have to text them and be like, can you meet now? And they're like, yes, let's go around the corner to this secluded coffee shop and I can talk to you for like 30 minutes, just because it was so hard to work around the attention on them, not only the people kind of watching over them, but the media attention, and everywhere they went, people were recognizing them and asking them about the North Koreans and such. So it was actually kind of challenging to do reporting, much more to do reporting at the Olympics than I had envisioned.
It seems to me like your familiarity really became key to your success with getting to know them. It seems like they let their guards down around you.
Yeah, I definitely started out. So the team, aside from having North Korean and South Korean players, also had North American players of Korean heritage. There were 6 total. So there were girls from Minnesota, Colorado, Toronto, and those were the players that I had first met and interviewed. And so as I was able to build a rapport and relationships with them, they were kind of the gatekeepers or opened the gates towards the rest of the team. There were, I'd say, a third or maybe 40% of the South Korean team could speak English somewhat fluently, but there were a swath of players that really spoke no English whatsoever. And so some of those players, I didn't have detailed, 2-hour, 3-hour conversations until after the Olympics, when I went back to Korea to kind of finish reporting, and I hired a translator, a fixer. And so I had all these tidbits I had heard about them or had kind of picked up about their lives. And it's kind of, after the Olympics, I was able to kind of open the book to all of that and finally sit down and get to know some of the South Korean players really well.
Seth, I have a question. I'm curious, when you went back after the Olympics, were you able to interview any of the North Korean players?
No, I wasn't. And so none of the players on the South Korean team, to my knowledge, have been in contact or seen the North Korean players again since the Olympics. There was one person I do know, a journalist in South Korea. So after the Olympics, about 2 months after, they had the World Championship tournaments for ice hockey. And those are broken down by skill level, essentially. So South Korea is in a higher division than North Korea is. But there were some South Korean journalists who went to the North Koreans World Championship tournament, and they passed along messages from the South Korean players to the North Korean players, and even, were able to go into the locker room and took some videos of the North Korean players that they brought back to show to the South Koreans. But me personally, in terms of reporting, I wasn't able to talk directly to any of the North Korean players. It was all secondhand, anecdotes coming from the South Koreans. And then the players themselves haven't been in contact with them since the Olympics in 2018.
Yeah. No, good question, Tom. Tom, I got one for you. The called shot. Baseball fans like me know what that is. When Babe Ruth points to where he's going to hit the home run and then does so, right? Wouldn't it have been
right?
Wouldn't it have been great if there was a video camera there to capture that?
There were actually 2 video cameras there. There were 2 individuals in the stands on the third base side, and unfortunately, since there were only two videos, they both came from the same angle. Yeah. So we don't really see exactly on the videos where Ruth is pointing. It's clear that he's pointing towards the outfield or towards the pitcher, but whether or not he's pointing exactly to right center, which is where the ball landed, that's inconclusive. But there is a little bit of video. It's very entertaining to watch. One of the videos was taken by an individual who saw that game and no other baseball game in his career. It was the one time he saw a game. The video was stored for years and wasn't discovered by the family until much later. But the 2 videos, when you see them side by side, show basically the same thing, and you get the sense of the crowd, you get the sense of the drama at home plate. And you see Ruth pointing, and then you see him in the video trotting around the bases, his little pigeon-toed run around the bases, taunting the Cubs as he circles the bases. So it's a short piece of video, but it's very dramatic.
We're using the word video, but this would have been that herky-jerky black and white film. Yeah.
Right. That's exactly right.
It's very expensive to run, and they were lucky that there were 2 cameras there in the first place. And how would you like to have been the next batter after Ruth did that? Because if it was Nolan Ryan pitching, your life would have been in question.
Well, the next batter was Lou Gehrig, and he hit the first pitch thrown to him also for a home run. So the
Okay.
Chicago Cubs pitcher was Charlie Root. So
That should be
so
worth-
Root gave up.
that
He
worth-
gave up the home run to Ruth, and then he had to face Gehrig, and he gave up on the first pitch a home run to Gehrig. So it was not a good day for Charlie Root.
Good heavens. Hey, Sasha, who's going to play Lottie Dot in the movie?
You know, this has been a question
I knew it.
frustrating to me. I've written, this is a book about, this is a conversation about sports and politics. The other side of my writing career, most of what I've written about over the last 20, 25 years is politics. I've written books, articles, and so on, none of which are photogenic and none of which are cinematic. And this book is absolutely cinematic. And I had all these plans. It was going to come out simultaneously in America, one edition, England, another edition. And the plan was I would go to Wimbledon this summer and I would launch the book there to a big hoopla, and I'd come back here and I'd launch it in the US Open to a big hoopla, and we'd get a whole bunch of movie attention around that. And, for me, obviously there are far bigger things to worry about in the pandemic, but for me, one of the sad things has been all of that went by the window. There was no launch in Wimbledon, the British edition was postponed, and nobody's making movies right now. So all of that sort of, momentum that I was thinking, all right, surefire thing, we'll get, Charlotte Johansson in and she'll play the young Lottie Dodd or whoever it might be. It's not there right now. So I would dearly love, I can't, if there's anyone out there with any interest in making a movie, I would dearly love Lottie Dodd's story to hit the big screens at some point. And frankly, I think there's a million different actresses who could play Lottie Dodd. She lived a long time. She lived to be nearly 90. So you'd need someone, a child playing her when she's 11 or 12. You'd need the adult Lottie Dodd. And then you'd need the elderly woman who ends up dying a very lonely, sad death in a nursing home in southern England in 1960, in a completely different world from the world of the high Victorian period that she was born into. Long answer to your question, but yes, someone out there, please tell me you want to make a movie about this.
That'd be tremendous. And Seth, I'd ask you the same question, but I guess ESPN would put together a documentary on the real people, right?
Yeah, and similar to kind of what Sasha was saying, things, I don't know if we're going like too inside baseball at the moment, but with the pandemic the past year really kind of quieted down just, interest around these stories, which is kind of sad because I would say Sasha, Tom, and I all are very much attached to these stories that we want to tell. So we're definitely happy for everyone tuning in today. But one of the things in writing these books, we all want as many people as possible to kind of be aware of them. And so that's why, happy to do Fall for the Book, who's doing something virtually, but it's been something I'd say the past year, all of us have probably encountered just this weird kind of time of, self-promotion in a pandemic, I guess you could say. But it is always encouraging to hear, whether they're people in sport or not. And for me personally, a lot of Korean American or Asian American just persons who have read the book have responded really positively to it. So that's something I take a certain amount of pride in so far.
Yeah, very good. By the way, anybody watching, please type your questions into the chat box and we'll get to them in a few minutes, I guess, as soon as somebody tells me to. And Tom, I can't imagine a movie be made out of your story. Would there be? It's already been done, right?
Yeah, the movie might take a different angle. I mean, the book tells the story of the entire 1932 baseball season, and then tells it in the context of what was happening in America, the presidential election and the bonus marchers. So it would be a difficult movie to focus, difficult to make a movie that focused on the whole book. I think the hook in the book that movie makers might be interested in, and like Sasha, if there are filmmakers out there interested in this, we could certainly talk later. But I actually got started on the research for this book because I came across a story of a murderer in an Iowa prison who was taken by the warden to the 1932 World Series. And I actually heard of that story in the year 2000. So I guess in a way, you could say this book took 20 years from the time that I heard that story till I actually got it published, written and published. But the story of the prisoner and the warden, they were both Cubs fans. The prisoner had been in prison for 34 years. He said if he could die a happy man, if he could see the Cubs play one time. And the warden told him during the season in 1932, well, if the Cubs make it to the World Series, I'll take you to Chicago. And the warden took this prisoner, this lifer, as his personal guest to Wrigley Field. And they saw Babe Ruth's called shot in Game 3, and they stayed in Chicago overnight and saw Game 4. And I think that story by itself would make a terrific movie.
I think you're right. We actually have a question from the audience now. This one is for Tom, and hi from Art, whoever Art is, but also for everybody. You can answer this, and it's a good question. It's one I thought of too, being handicapped and not being able to do long-term research. Do you consider yourself a historian first, or a sports writer first, or a writer in general, Sasha, in your milieu? So what do you think, Tom? Are you a historian or a sports writer?
Thanks for the question, Art. I think for this book, I would say I was a historian because I had to dig really into what was happening in 1932 and also do basically historical research into baseball. I don't really think of myself as a sports writer. I'm actually have an MFA in fiction writing, so I come at writing from the point of view, as I think Sasha and Seth do also, as a storyteller and trying to tell a story the best way possible. And in my case, and I think probably for all three of us, that begins with research. So I think I'm more of a historian than I am any other kind of writer.
Uh-huh. And Sasha, what about you?
I agree with what Tom was saying entirely. I'm certainly not a sports writer. This is the only book I've written on sports. What I feel is I'm extraordinarily lucky that I have managed over the last many, many years to write about things I care about. So I care about politics. I've written about politics. I wrote a memoir about my grandparents and this extraordinary milieu that they created in their house called the House of 20,000 Books. I wanted to do that after my granddad died, and I managed to do it. And, you know, one of the things on my writing bucket list has always been to write about tennis at some point, because I've always been, since I was 4 years old, I've been obsessed with tennis. And this last couple of years, I've had this immense privilege to tell the story of Lottie Dodd's life. And so, you know, for me, one of the great joys of being a journalist is I can go wherever I want to go. And if I want to be a historian and go into archives for 6 months, I can do that. But if I want to write about the, you know, desperate evil and peril of Donald Trump, I can do that too. And so I can go where I want as a writer, and I feel immensely privileged that this is how I'm spending my life.
And Seth, you're a journalist primarily, right? Is this your first book, by the way?
My first book, and in terms of like the historian question, that's really interesting because while I do consider myself a writer first, one of the more challenging but also more enriching parts of the book process was I kind of had to teach myself about Korean history and Korean culture as I was writing the book. I was born in South Korea, but I'm adopted, so I've lived primarily my entire life in the United States and never really knew much about, I knew the basics, I guess you could say, about Korean history and Korean culture, but in terms of writing the book and be able to give the context between why women in Korea had always been in a certain position socially, and the differences between North Korea and South Korea, the resentment and kind of just the separation of the country since the 1950s. In addition to the writing, there was so much research and reading, and that was one of the things, you know, about this book process that I'll definitely take with me, is this kind of newfound knowledge of the Korean Peninsula that I gained as I was actually doing work on this book.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to make a guess that you have a huge box of files or something like that you've accumulated over the course of the research. Would that be right?
That would be right. Although I have a very, I do like to transfer things digitally, which is very time consuming. So even with the paper files,
I'm laughing and I know why.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, you got a big box of analog notes, right?
Well, I do almost everything on paper, most of it pen and paper, although I did the actual writing of the text on a computer. But I've just recently tried to be cleaning out my study, and I have 7 banker's boxes full of files which includes loose notes, things written on the backs of envelopes, things written on post notes. At some point, I'll either go through them or just burn all the boxes, I guess. But it's a, yeah, I mean, I think, and to sort of reflect on the question of research in a broader way, I think some writers can focus very quickly and carefully on what they want to write about, but others of us, and I'd be interested in what Sasha and Seth have from their experience, some of us wind up going, finding a lot of dead ends, going down rabbit holes, finding things we're really interested to learn about, and then realizing much later that those are not things that actually can be put into a book. They might contribute to our general knowledge, but I think it's very hard to be an efficient researcher if you're trying to effectively cover all the material and look at all the angles that are necessary in order to understand the context of what you're writing about.
Right, and Sasha, I'm going to make a guess that you are a hybrid of both. You've got boxes of written notes and a lot of digital stuff too.
Yeah, I do. And if I took my audience on a tour, I could move my computer around this study. I'm on the attic in my house at the moment, and you'd see thousands of books and boxes everywhere filled with notes, because I am very tactile when it comes to the research. I like the sort of physicality of paper. I like old magazines or old photographs. And I take notes by hand. I record some of my interviews, but I always take sort of, very, very detailed notes by hand. And I found over the years that I personally engage better with the people I'm interviewing if I'm taking notes. I don't know why, but it works better for me. So I have in my basement dozens of boxes filled with notebooks and, everything else from 20 years of journalism. But very briefly, coming back to the story of my granddad, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, he was a historian. And he was a rare books collector, and there were 20,000 books in my grandparents' house, which is why the book I wrote was called The House of 20,000 Books. But my granddad had just stacks and stacks and stacks of material. So you'd go somewhere and there'd be sort of first edition William Morris manuscripts on a pile, or Karl Marx, handwritten Karl Marx letters, or, Turgenev letters. There was just sort of this remarkably rare material just sprinkled all over the house, and he didn't keep it in any sort of hermetically sealed, temperature controlled environment. It was just organic. It was the fabric of the house, and it got into my soul. And so when I do my research, I always try and make it, I love finding old photographs I can sort of touch the texture of, or I love going into libraries like the Wimbledon archives for this, and you find these musty old volumes of book material about someone like Lottie Dodd. And it gives you a sense of the world she was in, because you realize there were these sort of high Victorians in their cravats and their very formal clothing, sitting by the side of centre court at Wimbledon, copiously taking notes so they could write these very dense, very sort of, not highfalutin, but very, very dense articles on Lottie Dodd. So for me, it's, very much a sort of physical experience as well as a digital one.
Yeah, folks, if you got any questions, put them in the chat box. And by the way, if you want to buy any or all of these books, there is a button on your Crowdcast screen where it says buy the book. Just click it and have at it. Seth, in your research, what was the most surprising thing you came across? And this is for a point, we got a tiebreaker here. The most surprising thing in all of yours, if you read the whole book, the thing that sticks out to you that you did not know going into this, that really startled you?
I would have to say it has to deal with the goaltender of the Korean team, Shin So-jung, who was also essentially the star player. And I had interviewed a couple of her teammates. She briefly played college hockey in Canada. And I had interviewed some of her teammates there, and some of them had passed along the story that, they would talk to So-jung about what she wanted to do after hockey. And she said to a lot of them that she wanted to become an actress. And they thought that was kind of strange. And I thought that was kind of interesting, at least because in my conversations with her, she had never brought up any kind of interest in movies or the arts. It was all about hockey. And so one night, Tom was mentioning rabbit holes before. And one night I was kind of just on a rabbit hole in Wikipedia. And I came across the story of Shin Sang-ok, who was in the 60s and 70s, the most popular film director in South Korea. He made all of these renowned, revered films and basically was like the Martin Scorsese of South Korea. In the 1970s, Kim Jong-il, who was not yet the leader of North Korea, was assigned as kind of the head of the country's Ministry for Arts and Culture. And he, as some of you may know, was a huge cinephile. So he made it his personal goal to establish prestige among North Korean films and the North Korean film industry. To up until that point, they were making these B-level, probably even like C-level movies that were just embarrassing. And so Kim Jong-il abducted the wife of Shin Sang-ok. Shin Sang-ok then, in order to save his wife, went looking for her and was also abducted by Kim Jong-il. So they were under North Korean capture for about 7 or 8 years, I believe, until they were at a film festival in Vienna and were able to escape. And so as I was reading about this, I was like, oh, his surname is Shin. That's kind of funny. Like Sojung's last name is Shin. When I see her next time, I'll jokingly ask her about it. And so lo and behold, a few months later, when I'm in Seoul and meeting up with Sojung, I bring up Shin Sang-ok and she says, oh yeah, my great uncle. And so they were actually related, and that kind of relates to her interest in acting. Was her, I believe it's her grandmother's brother was Shin Sang-ok, the famous South Korean director who was abducted by North Koreans.
How about that? And she has a big role in the game against Japan in the Olympics, right?
Yeah.
That was sort of the most dramatic game for them because they scored.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They always saw Japan as the one game they had the chance of winning. Japan still was by far a much better team, but Korea felt, you know, if everything goes right, if all the breaks go their way, they have a chance of beating them. The final score was 4-1, but at the time South Korea scored, it was 2-1. And so you're in an arena in South Korea at the Olympics, and the crowd there is just truly going wild and just so immersed in it. And obviously the crowd is on their side. So for a while, in end of the second period, entering the third period, when it's 2-1, there's this real momentum shift and this feeling amongst the team that maybe they can pull this off. In every game, Sojung by far was the best player, so it all depended on how she performed, and she was great in that game. She actually probably, in my opinion, had a better game in their next game against Switzerland, which they lost 2-0, but she made 50 saves, I believe, or 51 saves against a Switzerland team that won the bronze medal in the previous Olympics. And just one more point about Sojung and her relatives, like it was interesting talking to her about how she felt about North Koreans being added to the team, given this family history of, you know, one of her relatives being abducted by Kim Jong-il in North Korea. And so when the news first happened that they were making the unified team, obviously that didn't sit well with her for a while.
Yeah, and the Japan chapter is one of my favorites in the book too, because you put us right there. The drama builds and builds and builds. All right, Sasha, your turn. The thing you did not know going into the story, and probably for me, reading it, tobogganing was one. I mean, what was the one thing you had no idea going into this, and it stays with you?
Well, you know, Lottie Dodd's whole life was a complete unknown to me going in. It was a fishing expedition. I was intrigued by what I'd seen at this exhibit. I did the research, and it turned out there was this absolutely marvelous story. And this character, who should be one of the great titans of sports history, had somehow become a forgotten footnote. So for me, the whole of her life story was an unknown. But maybe one thing, I think when you talk about tobogganing, I think that was probably it. There was a woman called Elizabeth Mayne, who was one of the great eccentric characters of the late Victorian period. And she was far and away the best female mountaineer on earth. She was also the best female photographer on earth. Her photos look and feel very much like Ansel Adams' photos. And she kind of adopted the younger Lottie Dodd and taught her the ropes of both literally of mountaineering in Switzerland, but she also introduced her to this adventure scene in St. Moritz. So you have this new sport, tobogganing, which had just sort of come onto the scene in the late 1880s. And all the male daredevils from all over the world came to St. Moritz to do the Cresta run because it was so dangerous and so lethal. And women were told they couldn't possibly do it because if they lay on their stomachs and toboggan down this crazy run, they damaged their uteruses and all kinds of things would happen. So Lottie Dodd said, of course I can do it. And she forced basically one of her top best friends, a guy called Harold Topham, to train her for months and months and months. And she did do it. She was the only woman to do the Cresta run. And she proved, I mean, this is the greatest glass ceiling she broke. She proved a woman could do the Cresta run. How did San Moritz respond? The Toboggan Club there responded by banning women from doing the Cresta run. And they were not readmitted until last year. So I think that's the single most extraordinary thing I found out, is the durability of these outdated sexist sort of ideas.
Right. Tom, coming to you for this question, you know, the called shot was a pretty familiar story, but your book starts, I believe, in 1918 and goes all the way up to 1932. In that time span, what did you discover that really resonates with you?
Well, it starts in 1918 because Babe Ruth in 1918 was a pitcher for the Boston Red Sox, and I wanted the book to begin with Ruth as a pitcher and end with Ruth as a hitter, to sort of cover his entire career. But starting in 1918 and going to 1932 allowed me to also reflect on how baseball changed in those years. I mean, baseball, you know, Ruth popularized the home run, and the style and strategy of baseball really changed from the Ty Cobb years in the teens up to the Babe Ruth years of the 20s and 30s. So although I start in 1918, I'm kind of moving forward through baseball history to bring the reader up to what is happening in 1932. And in terms of what was the most sort of startling or interesting discovery, was that a lot of the umpires in 1932 were players from the early part of the century, and they were extremely combative. And I tell one story in the book about an umpire named George Moriarty, who was a player with the Detroit Tigers and then later a manager with the Tigers. In 1932, he was an umpire, and he was in a dispute with basically the entire Chicago White Sox team, who then challenged him after the game under the stands. Moriarty said, I'll fight the whole team. We'll just settle this in a fist fight. And the Chicago White Sox pitcher, Milt Gaston, stepped forward and said, well, umpire Moriarty, you can start with me. And Moriarty hit him with a punch, knocked him down, broke his jaw, broke his own hand. And there was this huge fight then between Moriarty, a single umpire.
He's on the baseball.
Yeah. And this whole, I think there were 7 or 8 White Sox players involved in it. They were all fined and suspended, but you wouldn't see umpires initiating fights, physical fights with baseball players today. You wouldn't see that in the NFL, the NBA, NHL, you know, even in the most combative of sports. Probably not even in rugby.
Yeah,
would you have a player attack an umpire?
I have been tempted. In the old days, the rugby referee wore a bowler hat and carried a stick, and I'm thinking I would love to carry a stick. That would it would sure beat blowing a whistle. Well, folks, guess what? It's 45 minutes. It flew by. I knew that it would. I hope I didn't leave anything out. Folks, push buy the book on your Crowdcast screen, and I think that wraps us up. I think we're supposed to look at the screen and everybody wave if you want to. I have a special guest that's going to announce the winner of our competition. Hey now, who wins? Well, let's do some math. Sasha, you win by 2, okay? You told us.
Hey!
Congratulations, yes.
Your stuffed animal has made my morning.
I told you there'd be some surprises. So thanks for watching, and we've got one more of these Fall for the Book sessions left. Click on your follow the schedule, and we'll see you later in the week.
Thank you, Buzz.
Thank you.
And hold and look at the camera.